Live action One Piece is pretty good. Surprised? You had your serious doubts though, no? I certainly did. My first instinct, given the tumultuous track record of live action anime, was to follow Walter White's advice and tread lightly as best course of action, keeping three particular emotions in hand: dread, skepticism, and hope. But to my great surprise and relief, this version of One Piece works. Animation to live action is always a tricky endeavor. Such productions always risk making it something it wasn't before. Animation, and anime specifically, has also become a much more appreciated medium in this day and age. Live action depictions used to be the peak experience for telling beloved stories, but that's no longer always the case with something as aesthetically rich, diverse, and popular as anime. But the biggest risk taken in adapting anime to live action, and by association the greatest opportunity for reward, is that it's making it human. There's so much you lose abandoning an animated world, but likewise, plenty to gain when entering a human one. This is the place you most relate, empathize, and most importantly, connect with. If a production can unlock an animated series' potential to discover this connection, then needless to say, there's plenty of value there. And this series found it. That's what I'm here to discuss today. How this version of One Piece discovered its human side, worth telling. But before we touch on what changed, let's establish a baseline on what needed to stay the same. Every beginning is sacred, as sacred as opening a fairy tale with once upon a time. Stories change, origins rarely do. I find it fitting that One Piece is often referred to as a modern-day Odyssey. The author of the Odyssey, Homer, was not known for putting pen to paper. He was a great orator, going place to place to speak his great tale by memory. I like to believe where the trajectory of his story never changed, his details might have. Perhaps out of his own boredom of spitting out the same story, or maybe he never remembered it the same way twice. But what I doubt rarely changed was his opening. The one part rehearsed the most, the hook to catch people's ears. The middle is where we tend to tell our own story. One Piece's first arc, East Blue, tells the origin stories for 5 different characters, and together it creates one big origin of the Straw Hat crew. As we approach this live-action series with our dread, skepticism, and hope in tow, we knew this beginning was untouchable and non-negotiable to change. You can't start a fairy tale without Once Upon a Time, and you can't start One Piece without... The first thing the live action did right was staying faithful to this need, the preservation of the origins. They were told just as before, but again, what about the middle? What's the story that this version wanted to tell between its own margins? Well, that's simple. With human characters, you get to bring more human emotions to the table. Don't get me wrong, One Piece has always had a more mature, dare I say, human side underneath all of its cartoony goofiness. Emotional resonance has never been its weakness, quite the contrary, but certain emotions can be glossed over because honestly, they're not always necessary in animation. Animation is supposed to lend an ability to stretch the imagination, with the help of a library of wacky physics. And for characters not in action, you can put them into a default frozen state, so emotions aren't needed at all. But when depicting the real world, you can't provide emotions by accentuating them with the infinite options animation offers, or blend someone not in action lifelessly into the background. Now, One Piece is one hell of an eccentric world, so some of those wacky physics have to come over into live action. But, and if this is the right way to say it, these characters needed to be actively feeling more things. Otherwise, you would notice. Zoro couldn't always be sleeping. Luffy couldn't always be so one-dimensionally optimistic. Nami couldn't do that thing where she gets angry, her eyes go blank, she grows sharp teeth and starts screaming, you you get where I'm coming from. That's what the middle offered most notably for me. Luffy showed more empathy, Zoro felt more supportive, Usopp was sweeter, Nami was more vulnerable and deliberately detached, and Sanji felt more honorable. I'm not saying these characters didn't possess these emotions before, however, live action facilitated a need to dive deeper into those emotions to make it all just feel more authentically human. And no character was tasked with this more than Luffy. In animation, Luffy sometimes has this face. It's rather emotionless. I like how he's crafted this way, though. It makes his emotions more mysterious, making you hold your breath to wonder how he really feels. What it says about the character is that he's never really questioning himself, his values, or even a need to verbalize it, which is something we all love about Luffy in the first place. But this straight-faced persona would have never worked in live action. The greatest example from the series was how Luffy handled hearing Nami's backstory. In the anime and manga, he didn't bother to listen. That's okay because his message was, "It's fine, I've already made up my mind. Nami is a good guy and I want her to be my navigator no matter what you tell me." In live action, he retreats to the roof with Zoro where he shows remorse and empathy after hearing the story. He says, "She was just a kid. Nami's good. I want her to know that." I appreciate that we got a version where he listens and processes this story, while still managing to come to the same decisions and conclusions as the original. And you see it among the others too. Zoro and Nami bonded as two people with no friends to become friends who share their pasts with each other. Acknowledging the romantic feelings between Usopp and Kaya just felt more natural. It just adds more emotional gravity to Usopp protecting Kaya, and it parallels the love he has for his mother who also struggled through a life of sickness. In real life, Sanji felt kinder without losing any of that suaveness he's known for. That suaveness tends to outweigh his kindness in animation, but it seems more vice versa here, and I thought that was a nice change. This isn't to say that this somehow improved the characters, but I found it suitable to add a wider complex range of emotions that only human actors could achieve, given that certain attention to detail and nuance that animation often passes over. The original East Blue ran for more than 40 episodes and covered nearly 100 chapters in the manga. When granted the luxury of pace, like in this case, a story's message can become more inherent and lean on a more organic show-don't-tell method to deliver it. East Blue is one big arc composed of several mini arcs, and each feels just like the next step in the adventure. If East Blue weren't punctuated by the Straw Hats actually leaving the East Blue to enter the Grand Line, it might even be hard to consider this a major arc itself holding a message in the background. But if I had to nail a connected message existing across the anime and manga's version of East Blue, I'd say it's this. It's a message of inspiration. The Straw Hats reluctantly come together by being inspired by Luffy's seemingly infinite abilities, as both a fighter and a loyal friend, which is plenty good enough for the manga and anime, but it doesn't feel like enough for an 8-episode series with live action. You needed something stickier than here's some strong guy that believes in himself and others. This version needed to be more thematically intentional across all 8 episodes. Something the middle could work with. Something our human nature could latch onto. The message that was settled on was, to know who you are is to be free. Emphasizing this message helps refocus East Blue in this version. It's easy to point to this arc just as the beginning of it all, but slapping a direct message on it adds new perspective. It hinges on Luffy freeing his crewmates by bringing them along with him on his journey, but you can see its presence everywhere as one big thematic message. Zoro chooses to be held captive so that he can keep collecting bounties. The townsfolk of Orangetown are chained and forced to be a part of Buggy's audience. Clawdor keeps Kaya in both a physical home prison and mental prison in which she has no say for herself. Sanji keeps himself stranded back on that rock where he and Zeph were marooned by remaining at the Baratie believing that he has a debt he can never pay back. And then there's Arlong constantly preaching his philosophy on fishmen and humans. how one was forced into servitude under the other, and how Fishman's superiority should reverse those circumstances, which we see with Nami and Coco Village. You can feel the message highlighted by showing how trapped these characters are. Whether it's by choice, under their own volition, or pure delusion, they are kept from being free in one sense of the word or the other. The solution is the other part of the message, knowing who you are. And that's Luffy's true purpose in this version of the series, to remind everyone that's the key to freeing yourself. But with any saving grace, a threat to it is never far behind. And who better to threaten freedom the most than someone who understands and embodies it? Luffy and Garp, for better or worse, are chaotic beings. Chaos is a reaction to freedom, but knowing yourself and your values are what guide you to be free. Garp knows this, but he fears Luffy doesn't know the difference between the two. He knows Luffy will go out and cause trouble as a pirate, but what's driving him? It makes no difference whether he's a pirate or marine, though it does bother Garp he's one over the other. Kobe is also stuck in a controlled frame of mind, seeing the world in black and white, good versus evil, marine versus pirate. But over time, Garp helps him understand that if you know who you are, then you are free. And it's a brilliant first message to take away from One Piece. Of course, this message still works in animation. However, and I might get a little abstract here, animation is already the ultimate freedom when telling a story. You can draw whatever you want to make anything happen. Live action is constrained and shackled to who we are and what the world is around us. Even CGI has a ceiling. I find a message about discovering what it means to be free is fitting for a series that everyone knew would feel limited because it's stuck in the real world now. As if it were trying to break down those walls by trying to find the freeing spirit of the original as much as it could. Knowing it couldn't physically open itself that wide, it narrowed it down to capture it as a message instead, within a character-driven narrative. Where the original world of One Piece feels boundaryless, this story's message opens the boundaries of its characters and their freedom within. This might be the biggest deviation from the original. Something the middle really took liberty in moving pieces around. How the Straw Hats experience failure. I think back on Luffy's quote-unquote losses throughout the original. There was his first battle with Crocodile, or the time he got pummeled by Lucci. And then there was the sheer panic and hopelessness of Kuma wiping out his friends on Sabaody. But despite losing, you never got the impression that Luffy wouldn't rebound. He was always steadfast enough to get back up and go again better than before. Where you really first see Luffy feel the gravity of his own failure is after he loses Ace. Only then does failure seem to get the best of him. For so long, Luffy kept himself mentally strong enough to keep going no matter what. You could attribute that strength to him overcoming his first big failure, Shanks losing his arm in order to save him. Yeah, Luffy fails here. He's a stubborn, impatient kid that's angry at Shanks for not taking him on as a crewmate. He's also frustrated with Shanks for not fighting back against the mountain bandits, showing weakness and letting them walk all over him. When Luffy tries to stand up to the bandits, the dominoes fall and the consequences follow, with Shanks losing something to get Luffy out of the trouble he found himself in. Luffy fails, but it's a catalyst moment. It's this event that humbles Luffy, lets him learn from his failure, and prepares him to become who he's truly destined to be. A pirate captain in the mold of red-haired Shanks. Luffy is an internally resolved character by the time his journey starts, because he manages to overcome this initial failure. Only when he loses something he can't get back by fighting someone does he have to grow through that grueling lesson about failure again. But in the real world, failure is more regular and commonplace. I have a saying I live by. Every day is an uphill battle filled with failure. Big or small, that's reality. Without failure, you have perfection, and we live in a very imperfect world. If you're conveying the human world, falling down and feeling unable to get back up is normal. Live-action Luffy is still incredibly at peace with who he is, like his original counterpart, but his resolve is tested more here than it ever was in the original East Blue. The moment that achieved this was the aftermath of Zoro's battle with Mihawk. In the anime and manga, Mihawk of course defeats Zoro. Zoro then pledges himself to Luffy, vows to never lose again, then passes out. Luffy just smiles and laughs, accepting Zoro's pledge, then goes on to defeat Don Krieg. This all felt like a catapulting moment of hopefulness for the future, but in live action, it was rewritten as pure tragedy. Zoro does vow to never lose again, but he doesn't pledge himself to Luffy just yet before going unconscious. There is no Don Krieg to fight, so there are no immediate distractions. Nami doesn't flee to the Konomi Islands, and instead chooses to be the friend she never thought she could by staying. Zoro goes into a coma, and everything slows down. Nami is furious with Luffy for allowing Zoro to fight Mihawk. She questions his ability as a captain to make tough decisions. Together, the crew just waits around, unable to fight anything but their own inner worry, and pray that Zoro survives. I'd like to draw a parallel to another beloved animated property brought into live action for the first time, the 1990 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles film. Midway through the film, Raphael and Leonardo get into this argument where Leonardo tells Raphael that he's not needed among the brothers. Raphael then gets grievously injured and the turtles are ambushed by the Foot Clan, so they retreat to an old farm where, again, everything slows down, which often feels abnormal in animation, but appropriate in live action. There's this beautiful scene where Leonardo just sits in anguish by the door watching over Raphael, hoping he's okay. Leonardo feels the weight of his failure, the regret of lashing out in anger, and his irresponsibility as a leader. But time passes, and his failure invites reflection in. Eventually, Raphael does wake up. He and Leonardo put the past behind them, and the brothers become closer. This was a necessary defeat to reaffirm what the turtles believe in, which is each other. Only then do they return stronger. Luffy is also pressured to question and second-guess himself after Zoro is defeated. His choices have possibly led to a friend dying, and losing another friend in Nami for being irresponsible. Then, in the midst of it all, he fights Arlong and loses. Nami leaves the crew and now everything is appearing to fall apart for Luffy. So he sits with Zoro and admits the truth. He messed up. He failed. Now he needs his friends more than ever. Of course, then Zoro wakes up and finishes his speech from earlier, pledging himself as Luffy's first mate until the end, rebuilding that faith in him that he is a captain and that they're all in this together. Only then do the Straw Hats head to the Konomi Islands stronger and healthier than before. Failure brings reflection. Reflection creates healing. Healing builds strength. The Turtles film was considered fairly dark and mature for what was best known as a children's cartoon at the time, but the real world has more consequences, and therefore a more mature reality to deal with as a result. One Piece always towed that line between cartoon and mature storytelling, but to recreate this moment at a time in the story where Luffy was rarely bothered by the thought of failing made him so much more relatable as a protagonist. This Luffy ends up doing more than letting his fists speak for him. He's a remarkable human being that falls down from time to time, but then is able to reflect and heal before getting back up. Live-action One Piece's longevity will be determined by how much it can continue to adapt this property with a long-lasting legacy to a more grounded human world. Honestly, the odds are stacked against it given how the scale, story, and stakes evolve and grow beyond East Blue, but there are still plenty of extremely human moments worth recreating in real life that'll continue to preserve the hype and spirit for this series. I'll still keep some dread, skepticism, and hope handy going forward, but now more hope than anything that they can continue to pull off a sincere and genuine human take on One Piece.